I am joined here today by my friend once again, Joe. How you doing?
How's it going?
I'm doing terrific. Thanks for asking. One thing that we talked a little bit about, and I've looked into who you are as a person. You identify as a traditional conservative or tradcon. That's the term. What does that mean? How is that different from any other conservative?
Sure, and I think that kind of just goes back to what the goal of society should be. I mean, if we look at some more of a classical liberal sense, like the Lockean sense, the Hobbesian sense, all these different things, you're looking at things that are prioritized, like liberty, security. In the case of Hobbes, you look at all these other things, and being secure is not always good, but liberty is also not always good. So being a traditional conservative, I reject the useless platitudes that can be either good or bad on there. I'm focused on virtue. I'm focused on maximizing spiritual joy in a society. How are we going to make these people focused on a transcendent good, something that's bigger than them, something that gives them a purpose so they're not lost in a Nietzschean nihilistic dilemma where they have to try and fake something to make it beautiful. There has to be an absolute beauty in society. There has to be an absolute to strive for, a sainthood per se. So that's kind of that's kind of like what I would generally say about like what a society should be like. I don't think it should be one that is rooted in carnal pleasure. I think ours largely is. I think it should be rooted in tradition, the church, the nation, all these different things, our history, who we are, things
Well,
like
what
that.
tradition? There's lots of traditions out there. Which one? And
Well,
why
I
why
mean,
why is it the
I would say,
best?
yeah, I would say a Western tradition because the Western tradition is what writ large created the modern world. I obviously I'm Catholic, so I'm not necessarily 100% a huge fan of the Reformation. I think that that's what kicked off everything and got us to this point. Now, you can say the Catholic Church is partially to blame too. Yeah, sure, that's fine. I'll admit that. But the point is that the fracture happened then. People started not being unified under the same underpinnings anymore. Even though it was minor theological differences, those minor theological differences grew into an enlightenment. That enlightenment grew into a modernist view, and then that modernist view morphed into a postmodernist view. So we can question the absolute truth that the church is bringing forth, the doctrines. Now we can question the absolute truth of the kings and the lords lording over us that are telling us what the laws are. Now we're in the modern age. Now we can start questioning whether there even is God. And now the postmodernist, we can question whether there is anything.
So that's a pretty good breakdown of Western civilization, but I mean, the big identity crisis that a lot of these big movements, like for example, Blexit, Black people, or the Walkaway movement, or the Legsit, or all these different,
Right.
liberal demographics that have traditionally been Democrat voters are leaving. Well, where are they leaving to? Just to vote
Right.
straight down ballot Republican?
No.
No, of course not. There's this big crisis that's been going on since at least William F. Buckley, and that is what are exactly are conservatives conserving? And you talk about Western society as this, thing, but Western society is not a monolith. You got the French culture, the British culture, the American culture, um, the Greek culture, the Israel culture. I mean,
Well,
Jewish
subculture.
culture, you name it. I mean, what?
Subculture. So there's
No,
always
no,
this
no, 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 no. We
philosophical
don't call them
underpinning.
subcultures. We call them co-cultures because no culture is subservient to another.
Right.
Go be more woke somewhere
Right.
else, you
Right.
chauvinist, you. But seriously though, how do we know what aspect of what culture is good?
Right. And I mean, you kind of just have to analyze the things, and you can see this. You have to basically look at it. I think the Bible actually gives a pretty good example of this. What bears spiritual fruit?
Mhm.
What makes people happy? And I'm talking about long-lasting happiness, things that make people account for the consequences of a long-term action and the consequences of a short-term action. What better thing to do that than the promise of eternal punishment for wrongdoing?
Yeah, that's a pretty good metric, I would say. Uh,
Exactly. So that's just one example. And that this is what I mean by there's a value in a social order that promotes civic engagement through eternal reward in the end of it. Now, I'm not necessarily saying like I'm saying people that are going out there and demonstrating their faith. That's really what makes people happy, because demonstrating their faith, as long as that faith is what I would argue is a Judeo-Christian one, where there's a value on helping others in doing so. There's mitzvahs in the Jewish faith, and that's not just for other Jews, like a lot of the alt-right people will tell you. It's for anyone at all. And then in the Christian faith, obviously, love your neighbors yourself. Mm-hmm. So when you have these platitudes in society, when you have these underpinnings, these exist in all of those industrialized countries. Then you go to somebody in Hinduism where there's a caste system. You go into Buddhism where it's all about finding inner peace. People really aren't helping one another as much. Mm-hmm. It's there, but the helping one another is not how it works. And Japanese culture is a great example of this. It's so rooted in honor. It's almost like an ancient Greek system. And I mean one that was like not a Socratic or Platonic one. Like they valued honor and arete and stuff like that, which would be honor in Greek, sort of greatness in Greek, something like that. We don't really have a word for it in English, but the word is arete, excellence, greatness, honor, arete.
Honor. Okay. Somebody did a little bit of work in Japan, I sense, or quite a bit of studying in Greek. I want to ask you, what period and place in history do you think best emulated this sort of spiritual wokeness? I hate to use that term because it's definitely the wrong context, but what place in history and time would you say best emulated what you're talking about?
Sure, the High Middle Ages.
The High Middle Ages, so as opposed to the Low Middle Ages.
Well, the two Dark Ages. There's the two Dark Ages, and then there's the High Middle Ages. But you got to remember, that's a 400-year period. That's 200 years longer than America that regime lasted. And we're talking about a relatively unified Europe, because what would happen is, there'd be wars all the time between kings and lords and things like that. There'd be all sorts of power struggles in feudal Europe. But what would happen is, the Pope would step in right away, and he'd say, if you guys don't stop this war with your Christian brothers, you're excommunicated and you're going to hell. Until you repent and stop. So they'd stop.
So you think that's the best?
There's a social. So there's my point. I'm not saying that's the best. I'm saying that is what created the values that we have, and it's what allowed America to survive for as long as we did.
People to go to hell if they misbehave.
That's part of it. Yes, absolutely. I mean, think about the start of America. Why was America such a virtuous populace coming into the founding? Why were they so able to work so hard for their community and their families? I mean, if you read early 1600s pre-America sermons from people like John Edwards, it's fire and brimstone, bud, all of it.
Actually, you mean George Whitefield or John Edwards? I think was later.
It might be. I said I think it's John Edwards. I might have the wrong name. It might be Whitefield. I can't remember the names of the preachers.
Well, Whitefield was a bit more in the first Great Awakening, which is pre-American Revolution, but after the Puritans. And then I believe.
Now, who was the Puritan preacher that did the famous the
Sinners to the Hand Saving of God? That was Jonathan Edwards. I do think that was the First Awakening. Okay. I'm not sure, but it was
one of the examples. And it was John Edwards. That's what I thought. So.
Well, he wasn't the only guy out there. I mean,
no, there was plenty. There was plenty more though, and they were giving similar messages. It was a common message. The fire and brimstone in America, which was largely Puritan at the founding, and then obviously it branched out. We had Quakers a little bit later on. We had a bunch of other different groups and stuff like that.
Maybe a little bit of Catholics later on. But
yep.
So okay.
And Catholics, that one's obvious. So, that's
so
indulgences, confession.
You think that the happiest people were effectively Puritans?
No, I'm not saying that they were the happiest people. I'm saying they were people that were more concerned with working towards a greater future for their families, for their community, and for the glory of God. Mm. That's my point, and because all those things are implied with this. If you want to demonstrate your faith, if you want to be the best Christian of all, because you're a Puritan, the Puritan name is actually an insult. Oh, you're so pure. That's why they called them Puritans, because they were so concerned with themselves about being the better Christian, the best Christian, things like that, the most theologically studied Christian, the one that acted out the faith the best. So although there isn't a faith or a saving through works system like in a Catholic faith, it worked essentially the same way in the United States. So there's a reason it worked in the Middle Ages, and there's a reason it worked at the founding of this country. And that's my point. This is why we managed to stay Western so long. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I'm saying that is a Western idea. And that's why it works.
Okay, so what it seems is that the whole Western ideology, it's more of a conceptual model. It's not quite an ideology, but it's sort of an idea.
Right, but there are ideologies that wrap themselves around what does this Western value mean and how do we promote it? And there's those who say, no, the Western value is wrong, we need to get rid of it and create new ones. So that's the left for the most part. I mean, there's some things that I'm sure that they're different on. I actually think that the organized labor movement was a little bit more of a pro-Western style movement in America, even though they took elements from Marx. Largely, the proponents of it were strong Christians that were trying to benefit their families and their country in the future. So that was the point of it. That's why they did it. Whether it's right or not is a different story, but that's why they were doing it. So I would argue that that's a pro-Western movement.
So you, as a traditional conservative, you're not necessarily advocating for more prosperity or more happiness.
No, more happiness.
Oh, okay. Happiness. So that is the ultimate end goal of a traditional conservative, to promote happiness.
Right, but people don't know. People don't know what's best to make them happy. Communities sometimes do, and they do more often than not. As long as they're structured around a good church, the better the church in the town, the better it is. So there's a town by me called Wheaton that was a dry town up to I think 1990. Something like that, 1995. Something. It was complete alcoholism because their church had such a strong presence in the community, and the crime rates there were lower than everywhere else.
Interesting. So
because the church was in more control, it was more of a church community, and that's where Wheaton College is. By the way, I'm sure you're familiar. Big Christian college. I think it was Billy Graham that had a big role in the creation. He has a Billy Graham Center.
He's one of the alumni of Wheaton College. You should know this. You're a local. Why am I telling you that?
I'm not an expert on it, but I do understand what was going on there. The thing is I'm Catholic, so I can't even go to Wheaton, so I obviously didn't do too much research on it.
They do have Catholics over at Wheaton. I know a few people that go there, and they do tell me that they have some Catholic.
But they had to sign a statement of faith, which
that's true. They do occasionally.
It's basically you're actually not allowed to do that in Catholicism. You can't sign a Protestant statement of faith and remain a Catholic without going back and repenting for it in the past.
That is something that I do want to talk to you about, and that is when you talk about following the Bible, allowing control over the church. Which church? There's thousands of denominations, and are we allowing Pope Francis to give us? Does he have total dominion over our lives? When you say we let
no one does. God has total dominion over our lives. So and the things that we manage to all agree on should be what's governing us. I'm not saying the church in general. I'm saying that your town needs to have a church. It should have a Christian church, and it should have a strong role in your life until the point at which it's getting violent and seditious, and they're saying we need to hang Catholics like the Ku Klux Klan did or something like that. The message needs to be that the church is fractured and we need to get back to where we were at before in the Middle Ages when we were all together. Now, obviously, I would say that the easiest way to do that is to try to work with the Catholics because they're the biggest one. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I can't. I'm not.
They're also the most fractious because they're so big and they're getting increasingly disconnected with their different parishes. I mean, Cardinal Zen out in Hong Kong is basically left out to dry by the Pope. Cardinal Sarah in West Guyana is constantly getting slapped around by the different papal bulls. But it really feels as though Pope Francis is appeasing. I mean, he throws bones to both sides, but it really seems like his heart is more on the liberal
right
kind of theology. So
that's why I'm saying that the Pope shouldn't be ruling the world. I'm not advocating that.
Okay.
But what I'm trying to say is that the values of Catholicism and the teachings of Catholicism as they stand today, outside of a misreading of the no church salvation outside of the church doctrine that a lot of radical traditional Catholics try to use to justify Protestants going to hell. I think that's wrong. I don't know that. I'm
Didn't
not claiming.
the Pope, I think in the 60s or 80s, reject that theology?
He didn't reject the theology, he clarified it.
Ah,
It's
okay.
doctrine, it's true. There's no
Interesting.
salvation outside of the church. First question is, what does the church mean? And the second question is, who was the church referring to when that was written?
Okay. We're go ahead and finish that thought, please.
Yeah, so I mean, I just want to explain to people that yes, Pope Francis is a bad pope. He's not doing a good job. I don't agree with his thing. He's very anti-traditional as a pope. But if you look at the grand scheme of things, I'm not talking about the pope being our leader. I'm talking about an infallible theology being our leader. So it's like a constitution almost of
Yeah.
doctrine that was created with the guys that the flawed men who wrote it were guided by something perfect. That guidance by something perfect is the Holy Spirit. So if we're able to have philosophical underpinnings that exist on something, we need to try and exist on what we know is from God.
But does the Pope have papal infallibility?
I mean, I believe he does in certain instances when he's speaking ex cathedra. But I mean, I'm not expecting Protestants to believe that right now. I think they should, but
That the Pope is infallible?
of course, the Pope has no. Not that the Pope is infallible. That's a straw man of what I'm trying to say. The Pope is not infallible. He can speak infallibly under certain circumstances. That's
Okay.
it. I mean, anybody can go look up
So under certain
ex-Catholic.
circumstances,
From
he's
the chair of
infallible.
St. Peter regarding faith and morals, he is allowed to speak, and he has to proclaim it. He has to proclaim it in a certain way. It's like a decree. They used to call them in the Middle Ages papal decrees. It's a king's decree, and the idea and the whole point is that Matthew 16:18 says the gates of hell shall not prevail against the church. That's clearly a reference to saying, yes, you will have flawed people in there. Yes, it will seem like hell is attacking the church, and it will be, but it'll never win. So anything that the Pope is going to say and did say in the past or is going to say in the future as a Pope, even if he's a horrible human being, even if he's a Medici, even if he's a Pope Francis, he will never say anything
I love
that
how
is
you put
false,
Francis and
false
Medici in
theologically.
the same
I'm
category.
not. I'm just saying, like, bad popes. Bad popes people would know about. That would probably be it. Even Pope Alexander too. The Borgia popes as well. It's another people are familiar with. But even if you have bad popes like that, they're never going to use that power to do the will of the devil.
Well,
Papal.
there's Joe Enders for you guys. We're going to do one more shortly after this, and it's going to be on the traditional conservative rights and how that goes with the rights of the individual. Can't wait to talk about that. We'll see you very soon, guys.